The year is 1959. A man wakes up on a bench outside a hospital he doesn't remember entering. The city around him is unfamiliar. His head throbs where something metal was attached to his skull. And when he tries to recall how he got here, tries to remember signing any paperwork, agreeing to anything, there's nothing but fog and the distant echo of a voice telling him he volunteered. This is where the Outlast Trials begins. Not with monsters in the dark, but with the moment you realize the monster is the system itself, and you're already inside it. Over the next several hours, we're going to trace the complete story of the Sinyala facility, the Cold War program that turned American citizens into weapons through systematic psychological destruction. We'll meet the people who designed it, the victims who survived it, and the prime assets who became its most terrifying instruments. By the end, you'll understand not just what happened in those trials, but why this kind of institutional horror was possible in the first place, and why it never really ended. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into horror gaming's darkest corners, go ahead and hit that like button to help other fans find this video, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our community check in from everywhere, so get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's begin. The idea you need to hold on to through this entire story is simple. Murkoff didn't create broken people. They learned how to make breaking people profitable. Chapter 1. The World That Made Sinyala Possible. To understand the Outlast Trials, you first need to understand the fear that made it inevitable. The 1950s weren't just sock hops and suburban lawns. Beneath that carefully constructed normalcy, America was terrified. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Communist infiltration seemed to lurk everywhere. And then came Korea, where American prisoners of war came home speaking in praise of the regime that had captured them, confessing to war crimes they'd never committed, their minds seemingly rewritten by techniques the West didn't understand. This wasn't propaganda. This was documented, verified, and deeply disturbing to intelligence officials who suddenly realized that the next war might not be fought with bombs. It might be fought with consciousness itself. The Central Intelligence Agency launched a program to answer one question. Could you reprogram a human being? Could you erase someone's loyalties, implant new beliefs, create sleeper agents who would live normal lives until a trigger phrase activated them? They called it MK Ultra, and between 1953 and 1973, they conducted experiments that would have seemed like science fiction if the documentation didn't exist. They dosed unwitting citizens with LSD in public spaces to study consciousness alteration. They explored sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and surgical intervention on the brain. They funded research through front organizations, hiding behind university names and hospital credentials so that respectable doctors could conduct unspeakable research without public scrutiny. One location became particularly infamous, the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. There, a doctor named Donald Ewan Cameron ran what he called the sleep room. Patients came seeking help for depression or anxiety. What they received was induced coma, sometimes for weeks at a time, while speakers hidden under their pillows played recorded messages on endless loops. Cameron believed he could erase damaged minds and rebuild them from scratch, turn human consciousness into something that could be wiped clean and reprogrammed like a machine. One patient was an 18-year-old boy named Robert Logie, who came in with leg pain. He left unable to recognize his own mother, his mind so thoroughly destroyed that he could never rebuild a coherent sense of self. This wasn't a failed treatment. This was the treatment working exactly as designed. The question isn't whether this happened. The declassified documents are public record. question is what happened to all the research, all the techniques, all the accumulated knowledge about breaking and rebuilding human minds when MK Ultra officially ended? The answer is Murkoff Corporation, and they had no intention of ending anything. This is where institutional horror becomes more frightening than any monster, when you realize that the experiments didn't stop, they just went private. When you understand that the techniques got refined, not rejected, and when you recognize that the only real difference between government programs and corporate operations is that corporations are harder to investigate and easier to hide. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Signala, before the trials, before the reagents and the prime assets, there was a man who needed to prove he was more than his mother's disappointment. His name was Hendrik Joliet Easterman, and his story is where the nightmare truly begins. Chapter 2: The Making of a Monster. Hendrik Easterman didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a torturer. The path to monstrosity is never that simple. Picture him as a child, fragile, sickly, constantly corrected by a mother who saw weakness in everything he did. His brother Stanley seemed to earn approval more easily, creating a competition that would define Hendrik's entire life. Every childhood mistake became evidence of inadequacy. Every stumble proved that he would never be enough, never be worthy, never matter. This kind of childhood doesn't just create insecurity, it creates people who spend their entire existence trying to prove they deserve to exist, who measure their worth by external achievement because they never developed an internal sense of value. Easterman channeled that damage into academic success. He accumulated degrees like armor against the voice in his head that still sounded like his mother. Psychology, psychiatry, behavioral research. He became an expert in how minds work, how they break, how they can be reshaped. In another era, he might have done legitimate good. But Hendrik Easterman came of age in the 1940s and 50s, when the boundaries of acceptable research were being redrawn by governments desperate for psychological weapons. Until you realize that every breakthrough in his early career was built on suffering he never had to witness directly. His research involved prisoners and mental patients, people whose consent was either coerced or legally meaningless. He developed techniques for breaking down resistant subjects, creating psychological states where people would confess to anything, believe anything, do anything to make the pressure stop. His papers circulated in intelligence circles, catching attention from people who saw applications far beyond prison reform. In 1954, Easterman received a letter that would doom hundreds of people. Olivier Berenzi, assistant director of behavioral medicine at Murkoff's Mount Massive Hospital, reached out with careful professional courtesy. The subtext was clear: we have unlimited resources, no oversight, and the freedom to pursue research that other institutions would never approve. All you have to do is work for us. Easterman was cautious at first. He'd heard rumors about Murkoff, whispers in academic circles about research that went too far, experiments that had to be buried along with their subjects. But he'd also reached the limits of what he could achieve in conventional settings. Ethics boards were tightening restrictions. Public scandals were making administrators nervous. If he wanted to push further, to prove his theories, he needed to work somewhere that valued results over ethics. The partnership began slowly. Murkoff provided funding. Easterman shared techniques. The relationship was symbiotic. Murkoff gained cutting-edge psychological research, and Easterman gained the resources to become everything his mother said he'd never be: important, powerful, indispensable. But there was a cost he didn't fully understand until it consumed him. Murkoff didn't just want research papers. They wanted applications. They wanted techniques that could process hundreds or thousands of subjects, creating armies of programmed agents ready to be activated on command. And they had plans for a facility that would make everything Easterman had done before look like practice runs. The facility would be called Sinyala. It would be built in the Arizona desert, far from oversight and consequences. And Hendrik Joliet Easterman would be its director, finally achieving the recognition he'd craved his entire life. All he had to do was agree to transform human beings into weapons. One shattered mind at a time, he agreed without hesitation, because the worst monsters aren't the ones who know they're evil, they're the ones who believe they're doing necessary work. And Easterman believed. He believed he was serving his country, advancing human knowledge, proving that he mattered in ways his mother never acknowledged. The fact that this required destroying other people's minds was just the price of significance, a cost he was willing to have others pay. This creates the first major tension we need to hold. Easterman is simultaneously victim and architect. His mother's abuse shaped him into someone who needed external validation so desperately that he'd commit atrocity to achieve it. But that explanation doesn't excuse what comes next. Understanding how someone becomes a monster doesn't make them less monstrous. Keep that tension in mind. We're going to need it when we see what Easterman built and what it built out of him. Chapter 3, Project Lathe 1. When the weapons took control, construction on the Sinyala facility began in 1955. The location was chosen for maximum isolation. Arizona desert, unmarked roads, surrounded by landscape where screams would be swallowed by wind and distance. The facility itself was massive, a sprawling complex disguised as a government research installation, partially underground, designed to be invisible from aerial observation. Easterman arrived with a vision he called Project Lathe. The acronym's meaning was never officially recorded, but the purpose was explicit: create sleeper agents through systematic psychological destruction and reconstruction. His theory was elegant in its cruelty. He believed certain people possessed what he called charisma, not personal magnetism, but a psychological profile that combined suggestibility, adaptive behavior, and specific types of damage that left cracks in their sense of self. If you could identify people with extreme versions of this profile, you could leverage their existing fractures to reprogram them entirely. The first iteration of Lathe focused on finding subjects who already possessed these traits. Murkoff's intelligence network identified criminals whose psychological evaluations suggested suitability, violent offenders who showed paradoxical traits, capable of extreme brutality, but also of forming intense, cult-like loyalty to authority figures. Two subjects stood out immediately: Leland Coyle and Phyllis Futterman, who would become known as Mother Gooseberry. Leland Coyle was a police officer who turned his badge into a license for sadism. His files documented years of excessive force, complaints, suspicious deaths during arrests, and a pattern that suggested he didn't just enforce the law, he enjoyed breaking people who couldn't fight back. Coyle had been a soldier in World War II, and he'd returned home with skills that didn't translate to civilian life. He missed the clarity of warfare, where violence had purpose and victims had targets painted on them. When Murkoff's recruiters approached Coyle in 1956, they didn't threaten him. They made him an offer that appealed to everything he'd been missing: a facility where he'd have authority, subjects who couldn't complain, the opportunity to use every technique he'd learned in war and every impulse he'd had to restrain as a cop. They told him he'd be helping America win the Cold War. Coyle didn't need much convincing. He'd been waiting his entire post-war life for someone to give him permission to be exactly who he was. Phyllis Futterman's path to Sinyala was darker. Her childhood had been a theater of horrors. abuse so severe and sustained that her mind fragmented into alternate personalities just to survive. By adulthood, Phyllis barely existed as a coherent self. Instead, there was Mother Gooseberry, a maternal persona that expressed love through violence. There was the fun persona, manic and childlike, treating torture like a game. There were others flickering in and out, each one a different survival strategy crystallized into its own consciousness. Phyllis had killed before Murkoff found her. The victims were always presented as acts of love, children she'd been saving from inadequate parents. Her arrest should have led to institutionalization. Instead, Murkoff intervened. They saw potential where others saw only madness. Easterman designated these subjects as prime assets, the first tier of Lathe, meant to test whether extreme personalities could be channeled and controlled. Coyle was given authority over a police station mock-up where he could interrogate and torture while scientists observed. Gooseberry was placed in an orphanage setting, surrounded by mannequin children that her fractured mind could populate with whatever meaning satisfied her protective delusions. Both were told they were helping train new recruits for important government work. Both were encouraged to use whatever methods they deemed necessary. Here's where Project Lathe 1 began to unravel, and where Easterman learned something he should have anticipated but somehow didn't. Charisma cut both ways. Coyle wasn't just a sadistic enforcer. He was magnetic. Guards began emulating his methods, adopting his justifications, seeing him as a model of strength in a world gone soft. When facility personnel were supposed to restrain him, they instead found themselves seeking his approval. Within months, Coyle had effectively taken control of his section, with Murkoff's staff functioning as his assistants rather than his handlers. Gooseberry's influence was subtler, but equally corrosive. Staff who worked in her section began reporting emotional breakdowns, nightmares about failing to protect children, an overwhelming sense that they were complicit in terrible things. Her presence seemed to infect the environment, making people question their own perceptions of reality. By 1958, Project Lathe 1 was spiraling. Easterman had proven that certain personalities could dominate environments and bend others to their will, but that made them useless as controlled weapons. You couldn't deploy someone like Coyle if they might reprogram themselves and their handlers instead of following orders. The prime assets had too much agency, too much internal coherence even in their madness. They couldn't be broken because they were already broken in ways that made them powerful rather than compliant. Murkoff pulled funding. The project was designated a failure, but here's the crucial detail that shapes everything that follows. Easterman convinced his corporate masters not to terminate the program entirely. He'd learned something valuable from the failure, he argued. The problem wasn't the technique, it was the subjects. Instead of starting with extreme personalities and trying to control them, they should start with ordinary people and break them systematically. Create exactly the level of damage that would produce compliance without charisma, obedience without initiative. He called it Project Lathe 2, and this time, the subjects wouldn't be criminals who'd already committed to violence. They'd be ordinary people, kidnapped, processed, and destroyed before they understood what was happening to them. This is the moment where Signala transformed from a failed experiment into an industrial-scale atrocity. Keep that transformation in mind. The failure of Lathe 1 didn't make Easterman reconsider whether programming human beings was ethical or achievable. It just made him decide he needed softer targets. That decision would cost hundreds of people their minds, their lives, and their futures. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand how Murkoff and Easterman built the machine that would process those victims. Because the trials weren't just torture, they were theater, carefully designed environments where every element served a purpose, where suffering was calibrated and measured, where breaking people became a science with protocols and procedures. Let's enter the sleep room. Chapter 4: The Sleep Room and the Architecture of Control. 1958 marked Sinyala's transformation. Easterman had convinced Murkoff's leadership to fund Project Lathe 2, but he knew the corporation's patience was finite. This iteration needed to show results quickly and at scale. Murkoff launched a recruitment campaign across the United States. The advertisements appeared everywhere: newspapers, radio stations, unemployment offices. The messaging was calibrated to appeal to people who were struggling. Good pay for minimal qualifications. Room and board provided. An opportunity to serve your country while building a better future. The ads never mentioned Murkoff by name. They used front companies with names designed to sound official: American Behavioral Research Institute, National Psychological Health Initiative. Applicants were screened for specific profiles: people with few close relationships, minimal family ties, histories that suggested emotional vulnerability. Most importantly, people who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared for months or years. The recruitment was supplemented by less voluntary methods. Murkoff had relationships with law enforcement, prison systems, mental health institutions. Judges could be convinced to offer criminals a choice: serve your full sentence or volunteer for a program that would lead to early release. Psychiatric hospitals could transfer treatment-resistant patients to a specialized facility. Homeless individuals, drifters, illegal immigrants, anyone living on society's margins was fair game. The people selected for Project Lathe 2 arrived at Sinyala in unmarked vehicles, always at night. They were told they'd be participating in psychological training exercises, programs designed to enhance mental resilience. Some believed they were being trained as intelligence operatives. Others thought they were part of therapeutic approaches to treating trauma. The specifics varied, but the core lie remained the same: you volunteered. You'll be helping your country, and you'll leave better than you arrived. They were processed on arrival. Personal belongings confiscated. Medical examinations conducted. And then the most distinctive element of Easterman's program: the implantation of night vision goggles directly onto each subject's skull. The procedure was presented as necessary equipment for training exercises. In reality, the goggles served multiple purposes. They marked subjects physically, a constant reminder that their bodies were no longer entirely their own. They created dependency, as navigating the facility without the goggles' night vision was nearly impossible in deliberately darkened areas. And they served as a psychological break, a moment of body horror that began the process of dissociating subjects from their sense of self. After processing, subjects received their new designation: reagents. The term was deliberately clinical, stripping away names and identities in favor of a label that suggested chemical components. Each reagent was assigned a number. Their past lives were declared irrelevant. Easterman's recorded messages insisted that reagents should think of themselves as blank slates being prepared for important work. The processed reagents were then introduced to the facility's centerpiece, the sleep room. Easterman had borrowed the concept from Dr. Cameron's work, but he'd refined it for industrial application. The sleep room at Sinyala could house dozens of reagents simultaneously. The space was designed to be womb-like and prison-like at once. Soft lighting, comfortable beds, but no windows, no clocks, no way to measure time or orient yourself to the outside world. Speakers hidden throughout played Easterman's voice on constant loops. His broadcasts were masterfully manipulative. He presented himself as a father figure, concerned, paternal, someone who believed in the reagents, Potential. He praised their courage for volunteering. He assured them that discomfort was temporary, a necessary step toward becoming something better. The message underneath the caring tone was clear. Trust me, surrender to the process, and don't question what happens in the trials. Between broadcasts, reagents were dosed with pharmaceuticals designed by Murkoff's chemical division. The drugs enhanced suggestibility, making subjects more receptive to programming. They disrupted memory formation, creating temporal disorientation where reagents couldn't clearly remember how long they'd been in the facility. They induced mild hallucinatory states, blurring the line between reality and nightmare, and they created chemical dependency. Subjects who tried to resist experienced withdrawal symptoms that could only be alleviated by compliance. The sleep room was presented as a place of rest between trials, but it was actually where the deepest programming occurred. Easterman understood that physical torture left marks and could be resisted through defiance. Psychological manipulation worked better when it happened in moments of vulnerability, when subjects were exhausted, drugged, and desperate for anything resembling comfort. The sleep room offered that false comfort, conditioning reagents to associate compliance with relief and resistance with isolation and suffering. But the sleep room was only preparation. The real breaking happened in the trials, and that's where Signala revealed its true genius and its true horror. The facility was divided into distinct programs, each one a self-contained environment designed to destroy specific aspects of the self. Police stations, orphanages, factories, courtrooms. These were spaces that should have felt familiar and safe, places that represented order and protection in the outside world. At Signala, they had been transformed into distorted reflections of themselves, theaters where the rules bent just enough to create constant psychological pressure without breaking immersion entirely. And presiding over these programs were the prime assets, Coyle, Gooseberry, and eventually others. Their charisma hadn't made them useless after all. Easterman had simply found a different application. They weren't weapons to be deployed in the field. They were instruments of terror used to break other people into the shapes Murkoff wanted. This creates a crucial insight that we need to carry forward. Signala wasn't designed to feel like obvious torture. It was designed to feel like training that got increasingly uncomfortable, boundaries that shifted gradually, normalcy that decayed so slowly you couldn't identify the moment it became atrocity. That gradual escalation is what made it so effective and so difficult to resist. If you're still here, the next section is where we enter the trials themselves, where we see exactly what Easterman designed, how the prime assets were weaponized, and how ordinary people were systematically destroyed through experiences that felt almost reasonable right up until they became unbearable. The architecture of Signala was brilliant in the worst possible way, and understanding how it worked is essential to understanding why so many victims couldn't escape even when opportunities arose. Let's step into the trials. Chapter 5, The Trials, Where Morality Goes to Die. The first program most reagents encountered was called Snitches Get Stitches. Picture yourself in a police precinct. The architecture is familiar, booking desks holding cells, the institutional green paint on concrete walls that every municipal building seems to share. You've been told your objective is simple: identify a snitch among your fellow reagents and deliver them for punishment. The program's stated purpose is team building, learning to identify threats within a group. But the real lesson is far darker. In this place, morality is a liability. Loyalty to others will be punished, and survival requires becoming complicit in the suffering of your fellow prisoners. The police station environment is contaminated by the presence of Leland Coyle. Though Project Lathe 1 officially failed, Easterman couldn't bring himself to eliminate the prime assets entirely. They were too valuable as instruments of terror. Coyle stalks the police station with his electric baton, a cattle prod modified to deliver excruciating shocks without causing lethal damage. He has authority to do whatever he wants to. Reagents who fail objectives or who show insufficient enthusiasm for their assigned cruelty. His presence transforms every decision into a calculation. Risk his attention by hesitating, or compromise yourself by acting quickly. The snitch in question is always another reagent, randomly designated by the system. They might have done nothing wrong. They might have been trying to help others. None of that matters. The trial's completion requires dragging them to an electrocution cage and activating it while they beg and scream. Reagents who refuse or hesitate find themselves surrounded by ex-pops, failed subjects from earlier lathe iterations who've been driven violently insane but are still mobile enough to serve as obstacles and threats. The choice becomes clear: kill another reagent and move forward, or be killed by ex-pops and Coyle's intervention. Most kill. They tell themselves it's necessary, that the snitch would have done the same to them, that this is all part of the training and not really real. These lies become foundational. Every reagent who survives, snitches get stitches, carries the knowledge of what they've done, and that knowledge becomes a weight that makes the next compromise easier. If you've already killed once, what's killing twice? If you've already betrayed your fellow prisoners, why resist the next betrayal? Cleanse the Orphans presents a different kind of horror. Mother Gooseberry presides over a program set in an orphanage where mannequin children sit in silent judgment. Reagents are told they're rescuing children from contamination, cleansing them of impurities that threaten their innocence. In practice, this means locating and destroying objects throughout the orphanage while Gooseberry stalks the hallways, her alternating personas offering false comfort or sudden violence. The mannequins themselves become objects of horror. Are they really just plastic, or are those actual children who've been paralyzed by whatever drugs Murkoff pumps through the air? Reagents who try to check, who get too close, or stay too long examining the faces, find Gooseberry suddenly behind them, whispering that good children don't ask too many questions. The genius of this program is that it forces reagents to participate in imagery of child endangerment while being told they're protecting children. The cognitive dissonance, the gap between what you're doing and what you're being told you're doing, creates psychological damage that simple physical torture couldn't achieve. Truth and justice weaponizes confession. Set in a courtroom, reagents are put on trial for crimes they haven't committed, or perhaps have committed but can't clearly remember through the pharmaceutical haze. Evidence is presented that feels real enough to create doubt. Had they done those things? Were their memories reliable? Or had they been constructed by Easterman's broadcasts and the drugs in their system? The program culminates in reagents being forced to confess, not because confession brings leniency, but because the trial continues eternally until they admit guilt. The lesson is clear: truth is whatever Murkoff declares it to be, and fighting against that declaration only extends suffering. Each program ends with reagents returning to the sleep room, where Easterman's voice congratulates them on their progress. He never acknowledges what they've actually done, the people they've killed, the moral lines they've crossed. Instead, he reframes everything through the lens of training and necessity. You're not murderers, his broadcasts imply. You're soldiers. You're not victims. You're volunteers becoming something greater. And slowly, horribly, many reagents begin to believe him. This is where we need to pause and acknowledge what's actually happening here. The trials aren't just cruel. They're designed to make cruelty feel rational. They create situations where the worst choice is presented as the only choice, where moral resistance costs more than moral compromise, where the path of least suffering runs directly through atrocity. This design reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychology. Given the right circumstances, most people will choose survival over principle. They'll tell themselves that one compromise doesn't define them, that they'll resist at the next opportunity, that context matters more than action. But Sinyala is built on understanding that the next opportunity will present the same impossible choice, and the next, and the next, until resistance feels pointless and compromise feels like wisdom. The trials prove that you don't need to make people evil. You just need to make evil feel necessary. That realization that ordinary people can be systematically guided into committing acts they'd have found unthinkable weeks earlier is more frightening than any monster Sinyala could have created, because it suggests that the capacity for atrocity isn't exceptional. It's universal, waiting for the right circumstances to activate it. And those circumstances aren't difficult to create. You just need institutional authority, gradual escalation, and the removal of alternatives. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because the prime assets, Coil, Gooseberry, and the others we haven't met yet, aren't aberrations. They're just people who went through similar processes earlier, who broke in ways that made them useful rather than compliant, who learned to identify with their captors so thoroughly that they became indistinguishable from them. The next chapter introduces the deadliest prime asset of all, someone who didn't need to be broken because there was nothing inside to break in the first place. Chapter 6, Franco Barbie, the baby-faced void. Not all prime assets came from profiles Easterman originally designed. Franco Barbie represented something different, an expansion of the program beyond psychological damage into something colder and more disturbing. Barbie had earned the nickname Il Bambino, the baby, through his work as a mafia enforcer. The name was deliberately ironic. His face had a cherubic quality, youthful and almost innocent. This appearance served him well. People underestimated him, saw the baby face and missed the dead eyes behind it. By the time they recognized the threat, Barbie's knife was already moving. He'd killed for organized crime throughout the 40s and 50s, specializing in close quarters work. Barbie preferred knives and improvised weapons over firearms, more personal, more controllable, harder to trace. His kills were efficient rather than sadistic. He didn't torture for pleasure or draw out deaths for psychological effect. He simply eliminated targets, collected payment, and moved on. Murder was his profession, practiced with the same detachment a carpenter might bring to building furniture. What made Barbie valuable to Murkoff was his complete lack of moral framework. He didn't kill because he enjoyed it or because childhood trauma drove him toward violence. He killed because it was work that paid well, and he was good at it. This absence of emotional investment made him reliable. He wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't have second thoughts, wouldn't be haunted by guilt. The lights were on, but nobody was home, as one psychological evaluation later described him. His capture in 1958 was almost accidental, a police raid on a mob social club that happened while Barbie was present. The arrest led to charges that should have resulted in execution or life imprisonment. But Murkoff intervened before trial. They'd been monitoring organized crime networks for prime asset candidates, looking for individuals whose capacity for violence was coupled with high cognitive function and emotional flatness. Barbie's profile was nearly perfect, intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, violent enough to be useful, and empty enough inside that programming him toward new targets wouldn't require breaking down existing moral structures. The arrangement was presented as a straightforward transaction: work for Murkoff, avoid execution, potentially earn early release. Barbie didn't particularly care about patriotism or serving his country. He understood the deal: cooperate and live, resist and die. The calculation was simple enough. At Sinyala, Barbie was integrated into a trial called the Devil's Therapy. Set in a grotesque carnival environment, it combined elements of Italian folk, Catholicism, saints and demons, sin and redemption, with psychological torture disguised as therapeutic confession. Barbie's role was part priest-confessor, part executioner. Reagents were told they needed to confess their sins to achieve purification. Barbie would hear these confessions and judge whether the reagent had been sufficiently honest and remorseful. The judgment was always inadequate. Barbie would declare that the reagent was lying or holding back, and then punishment would begin. Unlike Coyle's enthusiastic brutality or Gooseberry's twisted maternal violence, Barbie's approach was cold and methodical. He killed efficiently without anger or satisfaction, treating reagents like livestock that needed processing. This clinical quality made him more disturbing in some ways than the other prime assets. Coyle and Gooseberry were mad. Barbie was sane, which somehow made his participation in atrocity more chilling. Easterman found Barbie fascinating and deeply unsettling in equal measure. The point of Lathe was to create controlled psychological states that could be programmed and triggered. But Barbie didn't need programming. He was already exactly what Murkoff wanted to create: a human being with all moral constraints removed, capable of any act without hesitation or aftermath. The problem was that this made him simultaneously perfectly useful and completely unreliable. You couldn't control someone who had no internal conflict to leverage, no desires beyond basic survival and comfort, no ideological commitments that could be manipulated. Here's the tension this creates. If the end goal of Lathe was to produce people like Barbie, functional, intelligent, utterly without conscience, then what did that say about the program's purpose? Were they really creating better soldiers, or were they just producing psychopaths who happened to take orders? And if someone like Barbie already existed naturally, what did that suggest about the thin line between productive citizenship and efficient killing? These questions haunted Easterman, though he never let them stop his work. Barbie became integral to Sinyala's operations, and the Devil's Therapy program became one of the most psychologically damaging trials in the facility's roster, forcing reagents to confess real or imagined sins, then being judged by someone who clearly didn't care whether confessions were genuine, created profound meaninglessness. At least with Coyle, you faced someone who cared about dominance. At least with Gooseberry, there was twisted affection underlying the violence. Barbie offered nothing but empty procedural brutality, and that emptiness was contagious. Reagents who survived his trials often emerge with their own empathy damaged, having learned that moral categories were performances without substance, that the only real division was between those who had power and those who suffered under it. By the early 60s, Barbie had become so integral that Easterman began developing plans to create more like him, not through recruitment but through deliberate destruction of conscience in otherwise normal subjects. If you could identify the neurological structures that generated empathy, could you selectively damage those while leaving cognitive function intact? The research was theoretical, but Barbie served as proof of concept. A human being without conscience was possible. The only question was whether you could manufacture that state reliably. Barbie himself seemed indifferent to his role in this larger project. He performed assigned functions, killed when instructed, and spent downtime reading magazines and smoking cigarettes. He never expressed curiosity about the facility's purpose or concern about the reagents he helped destroy. When interviewed by psychologists trying to understand his inner life, his answers were brief and uninformative. He killed because that was the job. He didn't think about it when he wasn't doing it. The past didn't haunt him. The future didn't concern him. He existed in a permanent present tense, doing whatever the moment required with the emotional investment of someone washing dishes. This makes Franco Barbie perhaps the most successful, prime asset and the most complete condemnation of what Sinyala represented. He proved lathe could work, that you could have a human being who followed orders and performed extreme violence without psychological deterioration. But he also proved that success looked like something deeply, fundamentally broken, a person-shaped void where a human being should have been. And that raises the question we'll carry into the next section. If Murkoff could create Barbies reliably, if they could manufacture people who felt nothing and killed efficiently, would that represent progress or the final proof that some research should never be pursued regardless of results? The answer matters, because the line between creating better soldiers and creating monsters depends entirely on whether you believe conscience is a weakness to be eliminated, or the last thing separating humans from weapons. Murkoff believed it was a weakness, and they spent decades refining techniques to eliminate it. Checkpoint: where we are and what's coming. We're about a third of the way through the complete story of the Outlast Trials. So far, we've covered the historical context that made Sinyala possible, the creation of Easterman as a monster desperate for validation, the failure of Project Lathe 1 and its evolution into something far worse, and the trials that systematically destroyed reagents while pretending to train them. We've met three prime assets, Coil, Gooseberry, and Barbie, each representing different ways that human psychology can be broken or revealed as already broken. What's coming next is where the story deepens and darkens. We're going to explore the mechanisms of control beyond the obvious trials, the pharmaceutical manipulation, the sleep room programming, the creation of an internal prison that reagents would carry even after release. We'll meet the survivors who tried to resist, the denizens who found strange spaces between victim and collaborator, and we'll trace what happened when Sinyala's operations finally ended, or more accurately, when they officially ended, because the techniques never stopped, they just evolved. Chapter 7: The Mechanisms, How Control Becomes Identity. Easterman understood something fundamental about breaking human beings. Physical restraint is the crudest form of control. Chains can be broken, locks can be picked, but a person who's been psychologically programmed to police themselves, who's internalized their captor's values, and monitors their own thoughts for deviation, that person is perfectly controlled without ever needing to be touched. The pharmaceutical dimension of this control was sophisticated beyond what most people realize. Murkoff's chemical division had developed drugs that went far beyond simple sedation. The compounds administered to reagents worked on multiple levels simultaneously. They enhanced suggestibility by disrupting the neurological processes that normally filter incoming information and compare it against existing beliefs. They impaired memory formation, creating gaps and uncertainties that made it difficult for subjects to construct coherent narratives about what had happened. And they induced dependency, creating physical and psychological withdrawal that could only be alleviated through compliance. One drug appeared frequently in facility documents, a compound referred to only as PTV. The formula was proprietary, but its effects were well documented. Subjects dosed with PTV experienced mild dissociation, a feeling of being slightly detached from their own bodies and decisions. The drug didn't remove agency so much as add layers of distance between intention and action. This made it easier to do things you might normally resist because the you doing them felt like it was watching from slightly removed. This was perfect for Murkoff's purposes. Reagents retained enough autonomy to complete complex tasks, but the psychological weight of those decisions felt muted, manageable, less likely to trigger moral resistance. The drug regimen was carefully titrated. Too much, and subjects became useless. Too little, and they retained enough clarity to resist. Eastermen and medical staff monitored blood levels constantly, adjusting doses based on observed behavior. Reagents who showed signs of emotional attachment to other subjects, forming friendships, expressing concern, received increased dosing. Those who seemed to internalize the program's values might have doses reduced slightly, a reward that felt like improvement but was actually a test to see if psychological conditioning would hold without chemical reinforcement. The architecture of the facility itself was a control mechanism. Signala was deliberately disorienting. Corridors branched unpredictably. Rooms that should have been identical had subtle differences that registered subconsciously and contributed to spatial confusion. Lighting levels varied without pattern. Temperature was kept slightly uncomfortable, never quite warm enough to relax. Sound was weaponized throughout. Speakers hidden in walls played ambiguous noises, footsteps that might be other reagents or X-pops or nothing but recordings. Distant screams that could have been genuine distress or atmospheric effects. Easterman's voice appeared at unpredictable intervals, sometimes offering false comfort, sometimes delivering commands, sometimes just speaking meaningless reassurances that created Pavlovian associations. The X-pops served a purpose beyond being obstacles. They were living proof of what happened to regents who failed or resisted. Some had been subjected to experimental procedures that left them violent and barely human. Others had simply been driven insane by prolonged exposure, their minds fragmenting in ways even Murkoff's scientists couldn't predict. But all of them remained in the facility, serving as both threats during trials and constant reminders of the stakes. The genius and the horror of Signala was that every element reinforced every other element. The drugs made you suggestible to broadcasts. The broadcasts reframed trials as necessary. The trials destroyed moral certainty and made you complicit. That complicity made you reliant on Easterman's reframing, because acknowledging what you'd really done would be unbearable. The pharmaceutical dependency made you physically reliant on the very drugs, destroying your ability to resist. And the X-pops provided constant visual evidence that resistance led to fates worse than compliance. Reagents entered believing they were volunteers in a government program. They exited, if they exited, as walking weapons programmed to respond to trigger codes without conscious awareness of being controlled. And between those 2 points, every mechanism had been designed to make the transformation feel like evolution rather than destruction, like becoming stronger rather than being systematically broken. But here's what Easterman never fully anticipated. Human beings are more resilient and more unpredictable than any model can account for. Some reagents developed resistance to the programming. Some formed connections despite the drugs. Some retained enough of themselves to recognize what was happening and to start planning not just survival, but opposition. These exceptions were rare, but they existed, and their existence would eventually threaten everything Murkoff had built. We're not there yet. First, we need to understand what happened to the people who didn't resist, who accepted the programming and were released back into civilian life carrying weapons in their minds that they didn't know how to disarm. Chapter 8, The release contract, freedom as a trap. After months or years in Signala, some reagents were eventually deemed ready for release. Not all, many never left, their bodies disposed of or their minds relegated to permanent ex-pop status. But those who'd successfully completed trials, who'd demonstrated the psychological changes Easterman wanted, who'd survived intact enough to be useful, these reagents were offered what seemed like salvation, a release contract, and a return to civilian life. The contract itself was elaborate, pages of legal language that most reagents were too exhausted to read carefully. The core terms seemed straightforward. You'd be released, provided with a stipend, given assist in finding employment through Murkoff's network. In exchange, you'd sign agreements acknowledging that participation had been voluntary, that you'd been fully informed of risks, and that you would never speak publicly about the program. The non-disclosure agreements were backed by severe penalties, criminal charges for espionage or treason, since the program was classified as vital to national security. But there were also subtler mechanisms embedded in the contract's language, clauses allowing Murkoff to monitor your post-release life indefinitely, requirements to attend periodic follow-up evaluations that were actually maintenance programming sessions, provisions allowing Murkoff to activate you for special assignments without requiring new consent, since your original participation had established perpetual availability. Most reagents signed without fully understanding. They were so desperate to leave, so exhausted, so worn down that the contract looked like the best deal they'd ever been offered. The readiness to sign was itself proof that programming had worked. They'd been broken enough to accept any terms, to prioritize immediate relief over long-term autonomy. The release process involved final procedures, medical examinations, ostensibly to ensure health, but actually to implant tracking devices and conduct final programming adjustments. Exit interviews with Easterman himself, who'd personally assess whether the reagent could be trusted not to expose the program. And one last session in the sleep room, where recorded messages reinforced trigger phrases and behavioral commands that could be activated later if Murkoff needed to deploy the reagent for field operations. Released reagents were given new identification with slightly altered names, close enough to original identities that they'd respond naturally, but different enough to create distance from pre-Signala lives. They received cover stories explaining their absence, classified government work, recovery from illness in a specialized facility, traveling for business that couldn't be discussed. These stories had supporting documentation that would hold up under casual investigation. Most importantly, released reagents were given new memories, not through science fiction implantation, but through subtler means. The months of pharmaceutical manipulation had already made their actual memories unreliable, full of gaps and uncertainties. Exit programming reinforced specific interpretations. You'd volunteered for an important program. You'd been tested but ultimately succeeded. You'd proven yourself capable. Alternative memories of kidnapping, of non-consensual experimentation, of being terrorized by prime assets were reframed as misunderstandings or stress-induced distortions. You hadn't been tortured. You'd been training. You hadn't killed innocent people. You'd been facing ex-pops who were already lost to madness. Released reagents entered civilian life, carrying time bombs in their heads. Most would live normal lives for months or years, working jobs Murkoff had arranged, living in communities where Murkoff-affiliated therapists could monitor their adjustment. They might experience nightmares or anxiety attributed to stress. They might notice gaps in memories or moments of dissociation that felt wrong, but which they couldn't articulate. Some would begin to suspect that something terrible had happened, that their memories of volunteering didn't align with other evidence, that the cover stories had holes they'd never noticed. But whenever these doubts grew strong enough to threaten Murkoff's secrecy, they'd receive contact. A phone call suggesting medication adjustments, a letter reminding them of legal obligations, or in extreme cases, a visit from someone who'd subtly remind them that Murkoff knew where they lived and who they cared about. The threat was rarely explicit. It didn't need to be. Reagents had been conditioned to understand implications, to recognize that certain lines shouldn't be crossed, to police their own thoughts and behaviors. And then there were the activation codes. Buried in their programming were trigger phrases that would induce specific psychological states or behaviors. A particular combination of words would shut down critical thinking and make them receptive to commands. Another phrase would activate training. They didn't consciously remember, allowing them to perform complex tasks, surveillance, infiltration, even assassination, while in a fugue state that would leave minimal conscious memory afterward. These triggers had been planted through the combination of pharmaceutical manipulation, repeated audio conditioning in the sleep room, and the psychological trauma of the trials themselves. Murkoff's ultimate goal wasn't to torture people for its own sake. The goal was to create a shadow network of programmed individuals who could be deployed anywhere, who would live normal lives until activated, and who would never consciously know they were weapons waiting for the right command. The release contract wasn't freedom, it was graduation. You were no longer trapped in Sinyala, but you'd never really leave. The facility had been rebuilt inside your head, a prison you'd carry forever, with Murkoff holding the keys to doors you didn't even know existed. This creates the central horror that we need to hold as we move forward. The worst thing Sinyala did wasn't the physical torture, or even the psychological breaking. It was the theft of certainty, making victims unable to trust their own memories, their own choices, their own sense of whether they were acting freely or following invisible programming. Some released reagents lived their entire remaining lives in that uncertainty, never knowing if the decisions they made were truly theirs or if they'd been activated without realizing it, used for purposes they'd never understand, then returned to their lives with false memories covering the gaps. That existential uncertainty, the inability to ever fully know yourself again, is a form of ongoing torture that never ends, even after the physical facility has been left behind. And that brings us to the people who refuse to accept this fate, the reagents who retained enough of themselves to fight back, to find each other, to build something that Murkoff hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. The Survivors Network. Chapter 9. The Network. Resistance in the Ruins. In the years following Sinyala's official closure, something unexpected happened. Released reagents who'd been isolated by trauma and non-disclosure agreements began finding each other. Not through official channels. Murkoff's monitoring network would have detected and disrupted organized contact. Instead, they found each other through cracks, through chance encounters, and gradual trust building, and the recognition that only someone who'd been through similar experiences could understand certain types of damage. It started in veteran support groups. Many released reagents gravitated toward these spaces because the language of military trauma felt closest to what they'd experienced, even if they'd never served. Talk of nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, gaps in memory. This was vocabulary that made sense in a way conventional therapy didn't. And occasionally, another person in these groups would say something that resonated in a very specific way, a reference to static or trials that couldn't be clearly remembered, the subtle signs that suggested this person had been somewhere similar. These encounters required extraordinary caution. Both parties would be monitored by Murkoff. Both had signed contracts with severe penalties for disclosure. But humans are social animals, and isolation is itself a form of torture. The need to connect, to verify that you weren't crazy, that what you remembered really happened. This need was powerful enough to make people take calculated risks. A survivor named David was among the first to deliberately build a network. He'd been through Sinyala in the early 60s, processed through multiple trials, released with programming that had mostly failed to take hold because of some quirk in his psychology that made him resistant to pharmaceutical manipulation. He'd spent years thinking he was losing his mind, convinced that fragmentary memories of prime assets and forced choices were elaborate delusions. Then he met another former reagent in a support group, and the specific details the other person described matched his own memories too precisely to be coincidence. David began deliberately seeking others. He'd attend different support groups in different cities, traveling under pretexts that wouldn't trigger Murkoff's monitoring, listening carefully for tells that suggested someone had been through similar experiences. When he found candidates, he'd approach gradually, testing whether they remembered specific details that only Sinyala survivors would know. The network grew slowly, carefully, always aware that discovery would mean Murkoff's intervention. At first it was just information sharing, confirming that memories were real, that others had survived similar experiences, that they weren't individually crazy but collectively victimized. This validation was itself healing. Trauma thrives in isolation. Knowing others survived the same events and carried similar scars made the burden feel more bearable. As trust built, the network's purpose evolved. Members began pooling fragmentary memories, reconstructing what had happened through collaborative recollection. One person might remember the layout of the police station trial, but not the orphanage. Another might have clear memories of Gooseberry, but only vague impressions of Coyle. By combining accounts, they could build a more complete picture than any individual possessed. They also began gathering documentation, release contracts that people had saved, medical records showing unexplained procedures, photographs of scars left by night vision goggles that had been surgically attached to skulls. Every piece of evidence was copied and distributed through the network, so that if Murkoff moved against any individual member, the documentation would survive. The network faced constant challenges. Some members had relapses into programming, suddenly cutting contact and disappearing back into isolation, suggesting that Murkoff had detected their participation and reactivated compliance protocols. Others were genuine infiltrators, people Murkoff had planted to monitor activities and report back. Paranoia was both necessary for survival and corrosive to the trust that made the network valuable. How could you build community when any one of them might be reporting back to the institution that had tortured you? Despite these obstacles, the network persisted. By the 80s, it had grown to include dozens of confirmed Sinyala survivors, with connections to potentially hundreds more who were too afraid to participate actively, but who received information and took comfort in knowing they weren't alone. The network began reaching out to journalists and researchers who might have resources to investigate Murkoff more thoroughly than traumatized individuals could manage. These efforts produced limited results. A few articles appeared in alternative publications documenting claims of illegal experimentation, but unable to provide the level of proof that mainstream media required. Congressional staffers received briefings that went nowhere because the programs being described were classified, and legislators with oversight authority weren't willing to risk political capital. Legal cases were filed and dismissed, running into barriers of national security privilege and lack of concrete evidence linking specific harms to specific corporate actions. But the network's existence was itself significant. It proved that even the most sophisticated institutional control mechanisms couldn't completely erase human agency and connection. Murkoff had spent millions developing techniques to isolate, manipulate, and control individuals. Yet people still found each other. They still chose trust over isolation, resistance over compliance, truth over comfortable lies they'd been programmed to believe. Doris, who'd survived inside Sinyala by becoming part of its economy, eventually joined the network after her own release. Her knowledge of the facility's inner workings made her invaluable for verifying details and explaining systems that other reagents had only experienced without understanding. She became a central node, connecting different clusters of survivors and helping newer members navigate psychological aftermath. The network developed its own healing practices, adapted from various therapeutic traditions but modified for the specific damage Sinyala had inflicted. They practiced collective memory exercises, where groups would reconstruct shared experiences and validate each individual's fragmentary recollections. They developed techniques for recognizing when programming might be activating the dissociative feelings, the urge to follow commands whose source you couldn't identify, and for resisting those impulses through grounding exercises and reality checks. Most importantly, they created alternative narratives to replace Murkoff's lies. Where Easterman's broadcasts had insisted that reagents were volunteers becoming stronger through necessary training, the network affirmed that they were victims of kidnapping and torture who'd survived through resilience and courage. Where institutional gaslighting had tried to convince them their memories were unreliable, the network provided collaborative verification that what they remembered was real. Where isolation had made each person feel uniquely broken, community proved that their experiences were shared and their responses were normal reactions to extraordinary trauma. The survivors' network never achieved dramatic justice. No climactic trial where Murkoff was held accountable. No moment when all victims were publicly vindicated. But it accomplished something perhaps more important. It allowed people who'd been systematically dehumanized to reclaim their humanity, to rebuild identities that weren't defined entirely by what had been done to them, and to transform from isolated victims into a community of survivors. This transformation didn't erase the damage. Everyone in the network still carried Sinyala's scars, but it proved that those scars didn't have to be borne alone, and that even institutions as powerful and ruthless as Murkoff couldn't completely destroy the human capacity for connection, resistance, and meaning-making in the face of atrocity. And that brings us to a question that's been building since we began. What happened to Easterman, the architect of all this suffering, the man who built Sinyala and refined its techniques? What was his fate? The answer is simultaneously satisfying and deeply unsatisfying, because monsters don't always face justice. Sometimes they just fade away, carrying their guilt or their delusions with them into obscurity. Chapter 10: The Fate of Easterman When Monsters Retire. By 1965, Hendrik Joliet Easterman had become a ghost in his own facility. The confident voice that had broadcast paternal guidance through sleep room speakers now sounded hollow even to him. The grand vision of creating programmed agents who would serve America and validate his life's work had devolved into managing crises, covering up failures, and increasingly desperate attempts to prove that Lathe 2 wasn't spiraling into chaos. The pressure came from multiple directions. Murkoff's corporate leadership wanted results they could monetize, not academic papers, but deployable assets who could be sold to intelligence agencies. The CIA's continued funding depended on demonstrating capabilities beyond conventional training, and the agency was growing impatient with Easterman's explanations for why activation rates weren't higher. More personally destructive was the realization that his brother Stanley, the family member who'd always seemed to earn their mother's favor more easily, was living a normal, successful life while Easterman had become director of an underground torture facility. The comparison gnawed at him during increasingly frequent insomnia. Stanley, with his legitimate medical practice, respected colleagues, untarnished reputation, versus Hendrik, hiding in the Arizona desert, conducting experiments that would make him a monster in history if they ever became public. Easterman began making mistakes his staff couldn't ignore. He'd order trial protocols that contradicted previous instructions, then deny having given original orders. He'd appear in observation rooms clearly under the influence of pharmaceuticals he was supposedly administering only to reagents. Most concerning were the broadcasts where his carefully maintained persona would slip and the raw psychology underneath would emerge. A man terrified of his own inadequacy, desperate to prove he was more than his mother's disappointment. The end came not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet, institutional decision-making. Murkoff's leadership determined that Easterman had become a liability whose continued presence threatened the program more than his removal would. They began gradually excluding him from key decisions, routing communications around him, assigning his responsibilities to other senior staff. Easterman recognized what was happening. He'd done the same thing to subordinates he deemed problematic, but he couldn't stop it. In 1966, Easterman was offered early retirement. The terms were generous in some ways, a substantial financial package, assistance relocating, agreements that Murkoff would never publicly acknowledge his role in classified programs. But the subtext was clear: accept this deal or face alternatives that wouldn't be pleasant. He took the deal. The official story was health reasons, which wasn't entirely false. Stress had manifested in physical symptoms, including elevated blood pressure, recurring tremors, and what might have been early signs of stress-induced cardiac issues. He left Sinyala in an unmarked car, driven across the desert one final time, watching the facility disappear behind him, in mirrors where hundreds of reagents had watched their previous lives vanish. Easterman's retirement was comfortable in material terms, but devastating psychologically. He'd spent decades building toward the validation that running Sinyala represented, and it had been taken away just as he'd begun to suspect that validation was built on foundations of horror rather than innovation. He couldn't talk about his work to anyone. The non-disclosure agreements were backed by both legal threats and more direct consequences. He couldn't seek therapy because explaining what was wrong would require revealing classified information. He was trapped with his own mind, endlessly replaying decisions and wondering if there had ever been a moment where he could have chosen differently. Some reports suggest he tried to write a memoir, documenting his theories and justifying his methods for future scholars who might understand what he'd attempted. If such a memoir exists, it's buried in Murkoff's archives, never to be published. Other sources claim he reached out to former colleagues trying to defend his legacy, insisting that history would eventually recognize his contributions. These attempts were reportedly met with polite distance. No one who'd been involved with Sinyala wanted to risk association once they'd managed to extract themselves. The final chapter of Hendrik Joliet Easterman's life remains unclear and possibly deliberately obscured. He disappeared from public record sometime in the early 70s. Whether he died of natural causes, whether Murkoff decided he'd become too great a security risk, or whether he finally took his own life under the weight of what he'd done, none of this is definitively documented. What's certain is that the man who'd sought his entire life to prove he was more than his mother's disappointing child ended his days, having proven only that intelligence and education are no protection against becoming a monster when given sufficient opportunity and institutional support. His broadcast remained in Signala's archives, his voice still occasionally used in trials because new directors recognized that the psychological conditioning he'd established continued to be effective. In that sense, Easterman never really left the facility. His consciousness, preserved in recordings and programming techniques, continued shaping reagents long after the man himself had vanished. He'd wanted to create something that would outlast him, to leave a mark on history that would validate his existence. He succeeded, though the mark was written in trauma rather than triumph. This is where we need to pause and acknowledge the deeply uncomfortable reality of institutional evil. The architects often face no meaningful consequences. Easterman retired with money and comfort. The corporate executives who funded Signala moved on to other projects. The CIA officers who provided oversight advanced in their careers. Justice, when it came at all, was purely symbolic, acknowledgement of wrongs committed, but no real accountability for those who'd profited from suffering. And that lack of accountability creates the conditions for repetition. Because if people can design and implement programs like Signala and then retire comfortably, what incentive exists to refuse participation in the next iteration? This brings us to the question that's been implicit throughout this entire story. What happened after? When Signala officially closed, when MK Ultra was exposed, when congressional oversight supposedly reformed these programs, did any of it actually end? The answer is both yes and no. The specific facility closed, the specific program terminated, but the techniques, the research, the accumulated knowledge of how to break and reprogram human beings, all of that persisted, waiting for circumstances where it could be applied again. Let's trace that legacy. Chapter 11, Murkoff's Long Shadow, the Legacy That Never Ended. The Outlast Trials, as a designation for Signala Facility's operations, officially ended in the early 70s as the CIA's MK Ultra program was exposed and congressional oversight made such blatant experimentation politically untenable. But ending a program on paper doesn't erase its effects or prevent its methods from metastasizing into new forms. Murkoff Corporation continued operations under different names and through different subsidiaries. The techniques developed at Signala, the pharmaceutical manipulation, the psychological breaking and rebuilding, the creation of programmed individuals, all of this valuable research was preserved in corporate archives. Some was sold to foreign intelligence agencies less constrained by public oversight. Some was adapted for private military contractors who needed to process soldiers quickly. Some simply went dormant, waiting for circumstances where such methods might again become valuable. The reagents who'd been released with programming carried their trauma into civilian life. Most tried to forget, to move forward, to build normal lives despite persistent nightmares and unexplained anxieties. Some succeeded at constructing plausible facades. Others struggled with substance abuse, failed relationships, and careers that never quite stabilized because some fundamental part of themselves had been broken at Signala and never properly healed. A few reagents retained enough memory and courage to try exposing what had been done to them. They contacted journalists, testified in obscure legal proceedings, tried to organize with other survivors. But Murkoff had anticipated this. The non-disclosure agreements, the cover stories, the lack of physical evidence that could prove torture versus consensual training. All of this created barriers that even determined whistleblowers couldn't overcome. Claims about underground facilities, and mind control programs sounded like conspiracy theories, easily dismissed by media gatekeepers who required more substantiation than traumatized memories and fragments of documentation. The facility itself was officially mothballed, though the buildings remained standing. Sinyala was too isolated and too specialized to easily repurpose, and the potential for contamination made it undesirable for civilian use. Murkoff maintained minimal security to prevent trespass, but the desert itself was the best guardian. Decades later, in the 2000s and 2010s, investigative journalists began piecing together fragments. Freedom of Information Act requests turned up redacted documents referencing Project Lathe. Congressional testimony from MK Ultra hearings mentioned Murkoff in footnotes. Elderly individuals came forward with stories of being kidnapped decades earlier, their claims now given more weight by accumulated documentation. But by then, the architects were mostly dead. Easterman was long gone. The corporate executives who'd approved funding had retired or passed away. The CIA officers who'd provided oversight had moved on. Justice, if it came at all, would be symbolic rather than literal. Acknowledgement of wrongs committed, but no real accountability. The legacy of the Outlast Trials wasn't just historical. The techniques developed at Sinyala influenced interrogation methods, behavioral modification programs, and psychological operations that continued for decades. Every time a government agency or private corporation decides that certain individuals' humanity can be sacrificed for broader objectives, every time sophisticated manipulation is deployed under justification of security or progress, echoes of Sinyala can be heard. The most haunting legacy was the proof that such programs could operate for years without meaningful oversight or intervention, that a corporation could kidnap citizens, torture them psychologically and pharmaceutically, attempt to program them as weapons, and face minimal consequences, that the systems designed to prevent such atrocities, legal protections, ethical review boards, free press, democratic oversight, all failed comprehensively, not because systems were overwhelmed by unprecedented evil, but because people within those systems made deliberate choices to look away, to accept justifications, to prioritize other concerns over the suffering of people they'd never meet. For reagents who survived, the question wasn't whether they'd ever fully recover. Most recognized that parts of themselves had been destroyed beyond repair. The question was whether they could construct lives that had meaning despite the damage, whether they could form connections when trust had been so thoroughly shattered, whether programming Murkoff had installed could be overcome by conscious choice and gradual psychological healing. Some found answers in these questions. Others carried the weight until it became too heavy, and their stories ended in ways that official records attributed to suicide or accident, but which were really just delayed casualties of Sinyala's operations. The facility might have closed, the trials might have officially ended, but the dying continued for years afterward, victims finally succumbing to wounds that had been inflicted a decade or more earlier. This creates the final tension we need to hold. Institutional atrocity doesn't end when the institution closes. It continues through the people it damaged, through the techniques it refined, through the precedents it established for what's possible when power is shielded from accountability. Sinyala's story isn't unique. It's just particularly well documented by accident of whistleblowers and FOIA requests and journalists who wouldn't let it go. How many other facilities operated in parallel? How many people carry programming they don't consciously recognize? These questions don't have answers. They have implications, and those implications bring us to the final section of this journey, where we step back from the specific horrors of the Outlast Trials and ask what lessons we can draw, what warnings we should heed, and why this story matters beyond just being a deeply disturbing piece of horror gaming lore. Because if you're still here after several hours of this, you deserve to know not just what happened, but why it matters now. Chapter 12, The Warning, Why Sinyala Still Matters. The Outlast Trials ended more than half a century ago. The specific techniques developed at Sinyala are outdated compared to contemporary neuroscience and behavioral manipulation tools. Easterman's crude pharmaceuticals and torture programs seem almost quaint next to what's possible now with fMRI imaging, genetic testing, and computational modeling of psychological states. So why does this story still matter? Because the pattern hasn't changed. Only the tools have improved. First lesson: institutions that gain power through violating human rights rarely relinquish that power voluntarily. Murkoff wasn't dismantled after Sinyala was exposed. The corporation adapted, evolved, and continued. This pattern appears throughout history. The organizations that conducted MK Ultra weren't eliminated. They were reformed and renamed. When atrocity is institutionalized, ending a particular program doesn't end the underlying capacity and willingness to commit similar acts. The structures, relationships, and expertise persist, waiting for circumstances where they can be deployed again. Second, classification and national security claims are tools that protect institutional crimes more effectively than they protect legitimate secrets. The vast majority of what was classified about Sinyala had nothing to do with protecting tactical advantage over foreign adversaries. It was about preventing domestic accountability. We should be deeply skeptical when institutions invoke national security to prevent oversight, recognizing that secrecy often protects criminal behavior rather than genuine intelligence sources. Third, corporate government partnerships create zones of reduced accountability where neither entity faces meaningful consequences. Murkoff could claim it was following government directives. Government agencies could claim they'd contracted in good faith with a private company. Each pointed to the other as primarily responsible, and the complexity of the relationship made assigning clear liability nearly impossible. This dynamic has only intensified in decades since Sinyala. Private military contractors, tech companies working with intelligence agencies, pharmaceutical corporations conducting research with government funding. These partnerships follow similar patterns, creating structures where atrocity can occur without clear accountability. Fourth, the path to participating in institutional evil is paved with small compromises and normalized cruelty. No one joins an organization planning to torture innocent people. They accept jobs, follow procedures, adapt to institutional cultures where objecting becomes harder than complying. This is why organizational culture and oversight matter profoundly, not because most people are secretly evil, but because most people are susceptible to gradual normalization of things they would have rejected if presented all at once. Fifth, vulnerable populations are always the first targets of institutional abuse. Sinyala recruited drifters, addicts, immigrants, anyone living on society's margins precisely because their disappearances would generate minimal inquiry. This pattern appears in every scandal of illegal experimentation and abuse, from Tuskegee to Willowbrook to contemporary immigration detention facilities. If we care about preventing future Sinyalas, we need to pay particular attention to how institutions treat people with the least power and visibility, recognizing that abuse always flows downward and targets those least able to resist or expose it. Sixth, reform without accountability is just preparation for the next cycle of abuse. After MK Ultra's exposure, there were reforms, oversight committees, stricter guidelines. requirements for documented consent, but without meaningful prosecution of those responsible, without institutional consequences severe enough to make similar programs genuinely costly, the reforms were mostly symbolic. They created new procedures without changing the underlying calculus that made programs like Signala appealing to institutional actors. Real accountability requires consequences that make responsible parties genuinely regret their actions and that deter potential future perpetrators. Seventh, technology amplifies both humanitarian and oppressive capabilities. The pharmaceutical and psychological techniques developed at Signala were crude compared to contemporary neuroscience and behavioral manipulation tools. Imagine what Easterman could have accomplished with modern brain imaging, targeted pharmaceuticals that can modulate specific neurotransmitter systems, and artificial intelligence that can predict and manipulate psychological states with unprecedented precision. The same technologies that enable beneficial medical treatments also enable more sophisticated control and manipulation. We can't put technological genies back in bottles, but we can insist on robust oversight, transparent application, and absolute prohibitions against using certain capabilities, even when doing so might be technically feasible. Finally, remembering institutional atrocities is itself a form of resistance against their repetition. Murkoff and similar institutions count on public attention being brief and memory being short. When scandals fade from news cycles, when survivors die without their stories being documented, when classified materials are destroyed or remain sealed for generations, the institutional knowledge of how to commit atrocity persists, while public knowledge of past abuses fades. This asymmetry favors those who would repeat history. That's why stories like the Outlast Trials matter, not because dwelling on horror is valuable in itself, but because understanding what happened, how it was allowed to happen, and how institutions evaded accountability is essential for preventing similar future abuses. The warning. The Outlast Trials offers isn't that uniquely evil people created a singular historical aberration. It's that ordinary people working within institutional frameworks can create systematic horror while maintaining their self-concept as professionals doing necessary work. It's that the distance between "this could never happen here" and "how did we let this happen" is shorter than we want to believe, and it's that preventing recurrence requires constant vigilance, absolute refusal to accept institutional assurances at face value, and willingness to believe survivors even when their stories sound too terrible to be true, because they are terrible. But that doesn't make them false. The idea we started with was simple. Murkoff didn't create broken people. They learned how to make breaking people profitable. That lesson was never unlearned. The profitability remains. The techniques persist. And the institutions that applied them are still operating, just under different names with different justifications, targeting different vulnerable populations. Signala isn't just history, it's a template, and templates get reused. The question moving forward isn't whether powerful institutions will attempt to manipulate and control populations through sophisticated psychological and pharmaceutical means. The question is whether we'll recognize it happening, whether we'll believe victims when they come forward, and whether we'll demand accountability that actually prevents repetition rather than just documenting atrocity after the fact. Because documentation without consequences is just record keeping, and record keeping without prevention is just preparing material for future historians to study while the cycle continues. Epilogue. The lights go out. The lights are dimming now. The sleep room is finally empty, its last occupant having walked out into a world that isn't sure what to do with their testimony. The prime assets are gone. dead, scattered, or lurking in shadows where institutions might still find them useful. Easterman's voice has finally fallen silent, and the facility itself slowly returns to sand and dust, becoming just another invisible scar in the landscape that holds too many secrets. But the reagents who survived carry Signala forward, in nightmares that never quite stop, in relationships that never quite form, in the gap between who they might have been and who the trials left them to be. They're scattered across the country, aging now, many passing on without ever receiving an acknowledgement of what was done to them. They're the living archive of institutional evil, holding testimony in bodies and minds when official records have been buried, and in the darkest hours when sleep won't come and the past feels more real than the present, they sometimes wonder, were they ever really released, or is this just another trial, one that lasts a lifetime, designed to test how much damage a human being can carry before they finally break completely? The answer doesn't come. It never does. There's only the waiting, the watching, and the knowledge that somewhere in classified archives their files still exist. Their programming is still documented. Their activation codes are still recorded. Just in case someone, someday, decides they're useful again. The question isn't whether institutions will try again. The question is whether we'll recognize it when they do. Sleep well. The trials are over. But Signala's lessons remain, waiting in the dark, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters have always been the ones wearing suits and carrying clipboards, the ones who turn suffering into policy and call it progress. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, the wind still moves through empty corridors, where hundreds of people learned that the worst prisons are the ones you carry inside yourself, built by other people's hands but maintained by your own uncertainty about what's real and what was planted there. The facility stands, the memories fade, and the lesson endures. When you let institutions decide that some people's humanity is negotiable, when you accept that noble ends can justify any means, when you prioritize comfort over truth and convenience over justice, you're not preventing the next Signala, you're building it.